The sun rose over the open ocean, casting a golden glow across the gently rolling waves. Jack Thornton, a seasoned fisherman in his early 50s, adjusted his cap against the glare and took a deep breath of salty air. For over 3 decades, the sea had been his second home, a place of peace, routine, and hard-earned survival. His boat, an old but reliable craft he called the Mariner's Hope, cut smoothly through the water. Today was meant to be ordinary: check the traps, cast a few nets, and return home before the afternoon heat set in. Jack loved the rhythm of these days, the simplicity of a life dictated by the tides. But the ocean had a way of surprising even its most faithful visitors. As Jack reached a quiet stretch of water, something unusual caught his attention, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the air and water alike. He paused, scanning the horizon. It wasn't a whale's song, nor the splash of a breaching fish. It was different. Moments later, a large, sleek shape surfaced near his boat. It was an orca, its black and white form cutting gracefully through the water. But something was off. The orca wasn't just swimming, it was circling his boat, vocalizing in a way that felt purposeful, urgent. Jack's heart quickened as he watched. Orcas were intelligent, but this behavior was beyond anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't hunting or playing. It was asking. "What are you trying to tell me?" Jack muttered under his breath. As the orca breached again, its powerful tail sending up a spray of water, Jack realized this was no ordinary encounter. The orca needed help, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand, it had chosen him. Jack gripped the edge of his boat, his eyes fixed on the orca as it continued its strange behavior. The massive creature swam in tight circles, occasionally breaching just enough to let out a high-pitched series of clicks and whistles. To anyone else it might have sounded like random noise, but to Jack it felt deliberate, almost as if it was speaking. He had encountered orcas before, but only from a distance. They were known as apex predators, highly intelligent and social creatures, yet unpredictable. Jack had always admired their grace and power, but he never imagined one would come so close to his boat, let alone interact with him. "What's wrong, big girl?" he murmured, leaning forward as if the orca could understand. The orca responded by slapping the water with her tail, sending a wave splashing against the side of the boat. She dove briefly and resurfaced closer, her dorsal fin slicing through the water like a blade. Jack noticed something strange, a faint trail of red in the water. His stomach tightened. "Injured," he muttered, his mind racing, or tangled in something. For a moment, Jack hesitated. This was a wild animal, capable of immense strength. Helping it could be dangerous, even fatal, if the orca panicked. But something in her movements, her persistence, her calm proximity to the boat, felt intentional, almost as if she knew he could help. Jack grabbed a pair of binoculars and scanned the orca more closely. His breath caught when he saw it, a thick fishing line wrapped tightly around her pectoral fin, cutting into the flesh. It was tangled with seaweed, creating a heavy drag that explained her labored movements. "Damn it," Jack muttered. The sight made his chest ache. He'd spent his life respecting the ocean and its creatures, but not everyone was as careful. The fishing line was likely discarded by someone who didn't think twice about its consequences. The orca let out another sharp whistle, a sound that Jack swore carried urgency, almost desperation. All right," he said, raising his hands as if to reassure her. "Let me think." Jack rummaged through his storage bin, pulling out a long pole with a hook on the end and a sharp utility knife. He wasn't sure how close the orca would let him get, but he had to try. He eased himself to the edge of the boat, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "Just want to help, okay?" The orca seemed to understand. She floated a few feet away, watching him with one intelligent dark eye. Her patience unnerved Jack, but it also steeled his resolve. Jack reached out with the pole, aiming for the fishing line. The first attempt missed, and the orca shifted slightly, making him curse under his breath. But she didn't flee. Instead, she stayed close, giving him another chance. "Hold still," Jack whispered, his hands trembling slightly. He snagged the line on the second attempt and began cutting carefully, the tension in the air as thick as the salt spray around him. As the line finally came loose, the orca let out a low, resonant call, almost like a sigh of relief. Jack leaned back, exhaling deeply. "There you go," he said, his voice shaking. But the orca didn't swim away. Instead, she circled the boat again, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she were still trying to tell him something. What now? Jack wondered aloud, his heart pounding. He had done his part, or so he thought, but the orca clearly wasn't finished with him yet. Jack sat back on the deck of his boat, catching his breath as the freed fishing line coiled limply at his feet. The orca floated nearby, her dorsal fin slicing through the surface of the water like a dark shadow. She wasn't leaving, and her behavior hadn't shifted into the calm retreat Jack had expected after the rescue. Instead, she lingered, circling his boat with slow, deliberate movements. Occasionally, she'd lift her head just enough for her intelligent eye to lock onto his, a gaze that felt uncomfortably human. "What is it, girl?" Jack muttered, leaning forward. His voice was soft, almost instinctively trying not to scare her off. "You're free now. Go on, get back to your pod." The orca let out a long, low whistle that vibrated through the water. It wasn't frantic like before, but it carried weight, as though she was speaking to him in a language he couldn't yet comprehend. Jack rubbed his hands over his face, trying to think. This wasn't something they taught in a fishing apprenticeship, nor was it covered in any wildlife guides he'd read. He'd heard stories of dolphins seeking help from humans before, but an orca. This felt different, more complex. As if on cue, the orca dipped below the water's surface, disappearing momentarily before reappearing on the opposite side of the boat. She slapped the water with her tail, sending a light spray toward Jack. All right," Jack said, standing cautiously. "What are you trying to say?" The orca dove again, this time swimming a short distance away before resurfacing. She paused, looking back at the boat, then dove again. Jack frowned, realizing she wasn't circling anymore. She was leading. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. The logical part of his mind screamed to let it go. He had done enough. She was free, and whatever was happening now was far beyond his understanding. But another part of him, the part that had grown up watching the ocean and learning its rhythms, couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Jack hesitated, gripping the wheel of his boat. The orca surfaced again, a little farther away, and slapped her tail once more. It wasn't random. She wanted him to follow. Against his better judgment, Jack started the engine, steering slowly toward the orca. "You better not get me killed," he muttered, half to himself, half to the creature. The orca swam ahead, keeping a steady pace, occasionally pausing to ensure Jack was following. The open ocean stretched endlessly around them, and Jack couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. He was far from the safety of the harbor now, the water beneath him growing deeper and darker. After about 15 minutes, the orca stopped suddenly, rising vertically out of the water in a spy-hop motion. Her large body stayed still as she surveyed the area. Jack cut the engine, letting the boat drift. "What now?" he asked, scanning the water. The orca let out a low, resonant call and slapped the water with her tail again, creating ripples that spread outward. Then she dove sharply, disappearing below the surface. Jack leaned over the edge of the boat, straining to see. Moments later, she resurfaced, this time with something in her mouth. It was tangled seaweed, but beneath it, Jack could see the glint of metal. "What the hell?" Jack whispered, his curiosity now fully piqued. The orca swam closer, dropping the seaweed and the object near the boat. Jack grabbed a net and carefully pulled it aboard. As he untangled the mass, his eyes widened. It was a small rusted chain with what appeared to be an old, barnacle-encrusted pendant hanging from it. The orca floated nearby, watching him intently. Jack held the object up to the sunlight, its details barely visible through years of corrosion. "Why bring me this?" Jack muttered, glancing back at the orca. Her response was another tail slap and a long whistle that sent a chill down Jack's spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and Jack had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning. Jack turned the rusted chain over in his hands, the weight of the metal far heavier than it should have been. Years of ocean currents had smoothed its edges, but faint details of the pendant remained visible, a series of symbols or engravings he couldn't quite decipher. He set it down on the deck, his gaze shifting back to the orca floating silently alongside the boat. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Jack muttered, still unsure what to make of the situation. The orca let out a soft, drawn-out whistle, almost as if responding to his words. Then she nudged the side of the boat gently with her head, the gesture surprisingly gentle for a creature her size. Jack crouched at the edge, peering over. "What do you want me to do with it?" he asked, gesturing toward the pendant. The orca submerged briefly, then resurfaced, fixing him with her steady gaze. Her patience unnerved him. Jack had spent a lifetime on the water, learning to read the behavior of marine life. But this encounter felt entirely different. The orca wasn't just an animal, she was acting with intention. Before Jack could think further, she dove again, this time disappearing for longer. The water rippled in her absence, and Jack's unease grew as the minutes stretched on. Just as he began to worry she might not return, her sleek form broke the surface, and this time she wasn't alone. Two more orcas followed her lead, smaller but equally imposing. The trio circled the boat in a slow, synchronized pattern, their vocalizations harmonizing into a strange, haunting melody that resonated in Jack's chest. Jack's pulse quickened. "Now what?" he muttered, his eyes darting between the three massive animals. The lead orca, the one Jack had freed, stopped circling and rose partially out of the water in a spy-hop motion. She hovered there watching him, her dorsal fins slicing the surface. The others mimicked her, their large, dark eyes fixed on Jack. It was as if they were waiting. Jack's fingers tightened around the edge of the boat. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence, that the pendant and the orcas were connected somehow. Slowly he grabbed the chain and held it up, letting the sunlight glint off its surface. The lead orca let out a sharp, high-pitched whistle, the sound carrying through the still air. The two smaller orcas echoed her call, their tails slicing through the water in unison. "You're telling me this matters," Jack murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "But why?" As if to answer, the lead orca dove sharply, her tail sending up a spray of water. The others followed, disappearing beneath the surface. Jack leaned over the side, scanning the water, unsure what to expect. Moments later, they resurfaced, circling again, but now in tighter formation. The lead orca breached halfway, her head angled toward a distant point on the horizon. Jack followed her gaze, squinting. There was nothing but endless ocean ahead, but the orca's intent was clear. She wanted him to follow. "You can't be serious," Jack said aloud, shaking his head. But the orcas persisted, their vocalizations growing louder and more urgent. Jack sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're going to get me killed, aren't you?" Despite his doubts, he felt a strange pull to comply. He started the engine, steering slowly toward the direction the orcas seemed to point. They swam ahead, their sleek forms cutting through the waves with practiced ease, leading him farther out into the open sea. As the boat moved, Jack's mind raced. Who had lost that pendant? What did it mean? And why did the orcas care so much? The ocean stretched endlessly before him, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay ahead would change his life forever. The horizon stretched endlessly, a shimmering boundary between ocean and sky. Jack's boat cut through the water as the orcas swam ahead, their dorsal fins slicing the waves with effortless grace. The rusted pendant lay on the dashboard beside him, glinting faintly in the sunlight. Every so often Jack glanced at it, his mind churning with questions. Why had the orca brought him this? What could it possibly mean? And where were they leading him now? The lead orca, the one he had freed, surfaced repeatedly, checking on him as though ensuring he was still following. Each time their eyes met, Jack felt a pang of unease mingled with awe. It wasn't just her size or power that unnerved him, it was the intelligence behind her gaze, the unmistakable sense of purpose. "Where are we going, girl?" he murmured, gripping the wheel tighter. For nearly an hour the orcas guided him deeper into the open sea, far beyond his usual fishing spots. Jack checked his GPS and frowned. They were approaching a stretch of water known for strong currents and rocky outcrops, a dangerous area even for experienced sailors. "Of course it's somewhere like this," he muttered under his breath. The orcas slowed as they neared a jagged outcropping of rocks jutting from the water. The lead orca breached and released a piercing whistle, the sound reverberating off the rocks like a signal. Jack cut the engine and let the boat drift, watching as the three orcas began circling a specific point near the rocks. His heart sank when he noticed what lay just below the surface, a tangle of nets and debris caught between the rocks. And in the center of it, something moved. Jack grabbed his binoculars, focusing on the scene. His breath caught. Another orca, smaller and younger, was trapped in the mess, its body twisted awkwardly as it struggled to free itself. "Damn it," Jack muttered, already reaching for his tools. He grabbed a knife and a gaff pole, his movements hurried but deliberate. The lead orca swam closer to his boat, her gaze imploring, as if urging him to act quickly. I'm going," Jack said, lowering the small dinghy attached to his boat into the water. He climbed in, rowing cautiously toward the rocks. The trapped orca's flailing sent waves lapping against the dinghy, making the approach precarious. "Easy there, kid," Jack murmured, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The lead orca positioned herself near the trapped calf, her body acting as a buffer against the waves. Jack marveled at her composure. She wasn't panicked, but focused, as though she trusted him completely. Jack reached the edge of the net and leaned over, gripping the tangled mess with one hand while sawing at the ropes with the other. The calf let out a series of sharp whistles, its movements frantic. "Hang on," Jack said, his voice soothing. "I'll get you out of here." The ropes were thick and soaked with seawater, making them stubbornly resistant to his knife. Jack's hands ached as he worked, but he didn't stop. Every time the knife sliced through another strand, the calf's movements grew slightly more controlled, as though it understood help was coming. Finally, with a last grunt of effort, Jack severed the main section of the net. The calf surged forward, free at last. Jack barely had time to retreat as the orca breached beside him, sending a cascade of water into the dinghy. The calf let out a high-pitched whistle that was immediately answered by the lead orca's deep rumble. The two nuzzled each other in a display of relief and gratitude that sent a lump to Jack's throat. He sat back in the dinghy, breathing hard. "You're welcome," he muttered, watching as the lead orca turned her gaze back to him. Her eyes locked on his once more, and she let out a low, resonant call that seemed to echo with something more than sound. Jack didn't need to understand her language to know what she was saying. The rescue wasn't over yet. Jack sat in the dinghy, water dripping from his sleeves as he tried to catch his breath. The calf, now free, swam in tight circles around the lead orca, letting out a series of joyful whistles. The sight warmed Jack's heart, but the intensity of the moment left him feeling small and humbled. These creatures, so massive and intelligent, had trusted him, and somehow the lead orca still wasn't done with him. She swam closer to the dinghy, her eye fixed on Jack. Her gaze carried a weight that was almost tangible, as if she was appraising him, deciding whether he was still worthy of her trust. Jack wiped his face, chuckling softly. "You don't make anything easy, do you?" he said, his voice hoarse from exertion. The lead orca responded with a deep, reverberating rumble. It wasn't threatening or impatient. It felt more like an acknowledgement. Jack shook his head, half laughing at himself. "Right, you're the boss. What now?" The lead orca swam a short distance away and stopped, her dorsal fin slicing through the water like a blade. She dove, leaving ripples that spread outward, then resurfaced a few moments later. This time, she wasn't alone. The other adult orca had brought something to the surface, a tattered piece of netting tangled with what appeared to be more fishing line. Jack leaned forward, frowning. "You're showing me this for a reason," he muttered. He grabbed the object with his gaff pole and pulled it into the dinghy. The line was heavily knotted, and attached to it was a broken buoy. Its bright orange paint faded from years of exposure. Jack examined it more closely. There were faint markings on the buoy, letters or numbers, but nothing he could immediately recognize. The lead orca surfaced again, letting out a short series of clicks and whistles. Jack didn't know what she was trying to say, but her urgency was clear. Whatever this tangled mess represented, it mattered. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Jack said, his voice quieter now. He glanced at the calf, who had settled near the dinghy, peering up at him with curiosity. The lead orca joined her, nudging the calf gently before turning her gaze back to Jack. "You're a family," he said softly, realization dawning on him. "You're looking out for each other." Jack scanned the horizon, his unease growing. If this netting was part of a larger problem, there could be more debris, or worse, more creatures trapped nearby. The lead orca slapped her tail against the water, breaking his train of thought. She swam ahead, pausing to look back at him. "She's not done," Jack muttered, sighing. He started rowing back to his boat, his movements heavier now with exhaustion. The orcas stayed close, guiding him back to the Mariner's Hope. Jack climbed aboard and hoisted the dinghy back into place, giving the buoy and netting another glance before starting the engine. "Let's see where this goes," he said, steering in the direction the orcas pointed with their bodies. The pod led him away from the jagged rocks, deeper into the open ocean. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far larger than himself. The buoy, the netting, and the pendant all felt connected somehow, but the puzzle was far from complete. As the boat pushed forward, the lead orca surfaced again, releasing a long, resonant call that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. She wasn't just guiding him. She was leading him to something important, something that would change everything. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel, his determination solidifying. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the water as Jack followed the orcas farther into the open ocean. The lead orca swam ahead with purpose, occasionally surfacing to let out a whistle or a deep, rumbling call. Her movements were confident, as though she knew exactly where she was taking him. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel, the weight of the netting and buoy from earlier still fresh in his mind. Whatever she was guiding him toward, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He glanced at the pendant resting on the dashboard, its rusted surface catching the fading light. It felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, but he couldn't yet see how it all fit together. The orcas slowed as they approached a patch of water that seemed eerily still. Jack cut the engine and leaned over the side of the boat, scanning the surface. The lead orca swam closer, rising partially out of the water in a spy-hop motion, her dark eyes fixed on him. "What is it?" Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The orca dove suddenly, her sleek body disappearing beneath the waves. Moments later she resurfaced farther ahead, her tail slapping the water as though calling him to action. Jack grabbed his binoculars and scanned the area. At first he saw nothing unusual, just endless water and faint ripples where the orca had surfaced. But then he spotted it. a large dark mass floating just beneath the surface. "Debris," Jack muttered, his gut tightening. He climbed into the dinghy, lowering it into the water with practiced ease. The orcas stayed close, their presence both reassuring and unnerving. Jack rowed cautiously toward the mass, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. As he drew closer, the details came into focus. It wasn't just debris. It was a massive tangle of fishing nets, ropes, and plastic waste, stretching wider than his boat. The tangled mess swayed with the current, its fibers glinting like a trap laid by the ocean itself. Jack's stomach turned as he spotted movement within the debris. A shape twisted and struggled, the water around it churned with panicked thrashing. "Another one?" Jack murmured, his chest tightening. It was another orca, this one larger than the calf he had freed earlier but still young, its sleek body trapped within the suffocating net. The creature's movements were frantic, its whistles sharp and desperate. The lead orca surfaced beside Jack's dinghy, her gaze locking onto his. She released a low rumble that vibrated through the air. Jack nodded as if she could understand. "I know. I'll help." He reached for his knife, his hands trembling slightly. Rowing closer to the entangled orca, he could feel the strength of its struggle rocking the dinghy. He gripped the edge to steady himself, murmuring softly, "Easy there. I'm here to help." The lead orca swam closer, positioning herself between Jack and the debris as if shielding him from the trapped orca's thrashing. Her calm presence seemed to soothe the younger one, whose movements slowed just enough for Jack to begin cutting. The work was grueling. The nets were thick and knotted, their fibers slick with seawater and algae. Jack's hands ached as he sawed through the lines, each cut feeling like a small victory. The trapped orca's eyes flicked toward him, wide with fear, but also, Jack swore, recognition. "It's okay, kid," Jack said, his voice steady despite the strain. "You're gonna be free soon." After what felt like an eternity, Jack severed the last section of net. The orca surged forward, breaking free in a powerful breach that sent water spraying over Jack and the dinghy. The young orca let out a high-pitched series of whistles, circling back toward the lead orca. The two touched fins briefly in what Jack could only describe as a gesture of relief and gratitude. Jack sat back in the dinghy, soaked and exhausted, but exhilarated. The lead orca swam close, her dark eyes meeting his once more. She let out a deep, resonant call that seemed to echo with more than sound. It felt like a thank you, but also something more, a connection, a bridge between their worlds. As Jack rowed back to the Mariner's Hope, he couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the end. The orca's trust in him had been earned, but she still wasn't done guiding him, and Jack, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, was ready to follow. Jack leaned heavily against the wheel of the Mariner's Hope, his muscles aching from the second rescue. The orcas swam beside the boat, their sleek forms gliding effortlessly through the water. The lead orca, her dark eye fixed on Jack, seemed to carry an air of determination as she pressed onward. Jack wiped his face, still damp from the spray of the freed orca's dramatic breach. "You're not finished with me, are you?" he muttered, glancing at the lead orca. She responded with a low rumble, almost as if she could hear and understand him. He glanced at the pendant on the dashboard, its rusted surface a constant reminder of the mystery unfolding around him. The symbols etched into it gnawed at his mind, and he couldn't help but feel they held a clue to what was happening. The pod slowed again, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Jack scanned the water ahead, but at first he saw nothing unusual. Then, as the lead orca rose in another spy hop, Jack followed her gaze and froze. In the distance, a jagged, weathered mass rose from the water, a shipwreck, its rusted hull half submerged and listing to one side. Jack stared, his pulse quickening. It wasn't uncommon for wrecks to dot the seafloor, but the way the orcas had led him here made this one feel significant. "Why here?" Jack murmured, squinting at the wreck. The lead orca swam closer to the wreck, her dorsal fin slicing through the water like a beacon. She released a long, echoing call that reverberated off the metallic remains. Jack maneuvered the boat cautiously toward the wreck, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of it all. When he got closer, the answer became clear. Caught against the shipwreck was another tangled net, its fibers straining against the jagged edges of the hull. Jack's stomach tightened as he spotted movement within the netting. "Another one," he muttered, grabbing his binoculars. A large sea turtle was trapped in the debris, its flippers flailing weakly against the constricting lines. The poor creature was visibly exhausted, its movements sluggish. Jack didn't hesitate. He lowered the dinghy once more, grabbing his knife and gaff pole. "You've got a knack for leading me to trouble," he said, half laughing at the lead Orca as he climbed into the smaller boat. She swam alongside him, her massive body steadying the dinghy as he approached the wreck. The netting was tightly woven and deeply embedded in the hull. Jack worked methodically, sawing through the thick fibers, while the Orca watched closely. The turtle, sensing relief was near, seemed to relax slightly, its flippers moving less frantically. "You're almost there," Jack said softly, his voice steady despite the strain. "Just hang on." With one final cut, the netting gave way and the turtle floated free. Jack reached out, guiding the animal gently away from the wreck. It paused for a moment, its dark eyes meeting his before swimming off into the open water. Jack sat back in the dinghy, breathing hard. The lead Orca let out a powerful call, echoed by the others in the pod. The sound was triumphant, resonating through the water and the air. As Jack rowed back to his boat, he glanced at the wreck again. The pendant, the netting, the wreck. They were all connected. But how? The lead Orca had brought him here for a reason, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell him something more profound. Back on the Mariner's Hope, Jack watched the pod regroup. The lead Orca swam close to the boat, her gaze locked onto him. She slapped her tail against the water, sending ripples across the surface before diving deep. Moments later, she resurfaced, holding something in her mouth. A weathered piece of wood, its surface etched with similar markings to the pendant. She released it near the boat, nudging it gently toward Jack. He hauled the object aboard, his mind racing. The symbols were clearer now, etched with precision and purpose. They weren't random. They were part of something bigger, a story the Orcas seemed desperate to share. As Jack held the wooden fragment, he glanced back at the lead Orca. "You're trying to show me something," he said softly. "But what?" The Orca let out a long, resonant call that seemed to echo with a singular message. "Keep going." Jack tightened his grip on the wheel, determination etched on his face. Whatever this mystery was, he wasn't stopping now. The Orcas were counting on him, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he felt an obligation to see it through. The wooden fragment lay on the dashboard of the Mariner's Hope, its carvings catching the light of the setting sun. Jack stared at it, his fingers tracing the intricate grooves. The symbols were unfamiliar, almost ancient, their meanings hidden just beyond his grasp. It was the second artifact the lead Orca had brought him, and Jack felt the weight of its significance. The Orca pod swam near the boat, their movements calm but purposeful. The lead Orca surfaced, releasing a deep, rolling rumble that echoed across the water. Jack had learned to read her signals by now. She was waiting, giving him time to process before urging him onward. Jack leaned against the wheel, exhaling deeply. "All right," he said aloud. "You've got my attention. Let's see where this goes." He started the engine, steering slowly in the direction the Orcas pointed with their movements. The ocean was vast and still, the horizon glowing orange and pink as the day faded into evening. Jack couldn't help but feel the enormity of the moment, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. The pod led him farther out, their sleek bodies cutting through the water in perfect synchrony. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about rescuing trapped creatures or retrieving lost artifacts. The Orcas were trying to share something bigger, something profound. After another hour of steady travel, the lead Orca slowed. her tail creating ripples that shimmered in the fading light. Jack cut the engine and let the boat drift, watching as she dove deep, disappearing into the darkening water. Minutes passed, and Jack felt the familiar pang of unease creep up his spine. The pod lingered near the boat, their movements steady but watchful. Finally, the lead orca resurfaced, this time with another object in her mouth. Jack squinted, leaning over the side of the boat. The orca swam closer, releasing the item, a rusted metal plate, beside the boat. Jack grabbed his gaff pole and carefully hauled it aboard. The plate was heavy and corroded, but faint markings were still visible. "What's this?" Jack muttered, brushing away seaweed and grime. The markings on the plate matched the symbols on the wooden fragment and the pendant. They weren't random. They were part of the same puzzle. Jack's pulse quickened. "This can't just be coincidence," he said, glancing at the lead orca. She floated nearby, her dark eyes fixed on him. He leaned back, his mind racing. The artifacts told a story, but he didn't have the tools or knowledge to decipher it. Still, the orca's persistence made one thing clear. They believed this was important, and they were trusting him to figure it out. As Jack stared at the symbols, a thought struck him. "You're showing me pieces," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "But there's more, isn't there?" The lead orca responded with a long, resonant call that sent chills through Jack's chest. She slapped her tail against the water, diving again, and the rest of the pod followed. Jack looked at the artifacts now spread out before him, the pendant, the wooden fragment, and the metal plate. They were fragments of a larger story, one buried beneath the waves. He didn't know what he would find next, but he knew one thing. The orcas weren't leading him astray. They were guiding him toward a truth he couldn't yet comprehend, one that connected their world and his in ways he had never imagined. Gripping the wheel, Jack started the engine again, his resolve hardening. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, its depths full of secrets. Whatever the orcas wanted him to uncover, he was ready to keep going. The story wasn't finished, not yet. The ocean stretched like an endless canvas of shifting blues and grays, the last light of the sun slipping below the horizon. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel of the Mariner's Hope, his eyes scanning the water as the pod of orcas swam ahead. They had been leading him for hours now, and though exhaustion gnawed at him, he couldn't bring himself to stop. The artifacts on his dashboard, the pendant, the wooden fragment, and the rusted metal plate, felt like breadcrumbs in a trail leading to something monumental. The lead orca surfaced again, releasing a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air and water alike. Jack slowed the boat, watching as she turned sharply, guiding the pod toward a distant, shadowy shape rising out of the water. It was an island. Jack frowned, leaning forward. The landmass was small and uninhabited, its rocky cliffs jagged and unwelcoming. Waves crashed against the shoreline, sending sprays of white foam into the air. He had never seen this island marked on any of his charts, and he couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease. "What are you showing me now?" he muttered, cutting the engine as he approached the shallows. The orcas circled the boat, their movements slower, almost reverent. The lead orca breached, releasing a series of high-pitched clicks and whistles. Jack grabbed his binoculars and scanned the rocky shore. His breath caught when he spotted it, a structure, barely visible against the darkened cliffs. It was ancient, weathered by time and the relentless assault of the sea. What remained appeared to be the remnants of a stone archway, half collapsed and covered in algae and barnacles. Jack's heart raced. The symbols etched into the artifacts on his boat suddenly clicked into place. They matched the faint carvings on the stones. "This can't be real," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. The lead orca swam closer, nudging the boat gently as if urging him forward. Jack swallowed hard, lowering the dinghy into the water once more. His hands trembled as he climbed in, gripping his flashlight tightly. As he rowed toward the shore, the orcas stayed close, their sleek forms cutting through the water like sentinels. Jack reached the rocky beach, the dinghy scraping against the stones as he pulled it ashore. The air was heavy, damp with the smell of salt and decay. Jack approached the archway cautiously, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the stones. The carvings were clearer now, symbols spiraling across the surface in intricate patterns. They were the same as those on the pendant and the other artifacts, but here they stretched outward like a map or a story. Kneeling before the archway, Jack ran his fingers over the grooves. The craftsmanship was ancient, yet precise, each symbol carved with purpose. As he studied the markings, the lead orca surfaced nearby, releasing a low rumble that echoed through the night. "You led me here," Jack murmured, glancing back at the water. "Why? What does this mean to you?" The answer came not in words but in action. The lead orca swam to a shallow outcropping and began slapping her tail against the water with increasing urgency. Jack turned his flashlight toward her and froze. Caught in the shallows near the rocks was another net, its fibers tangled with something massive and unmoving. Jack's chest tightened as he realized what it was. Another orca, this one unmoving, its body limp within the net's cruel embrace. Jack scrambled to the water's edge, adrenaline surging through him. He splashed into the shallows, knife in hand, his exhaustion forgotten. The lead orca swam alongside him, releasing a series of urgent clicks and whistles. "I see it!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse. "I'll get her out!" The net was deeply embedded in the rocks, its lines cutting into the orca's skin. Jack worked feverishly, sawing through the thick ropes as water splashed around him. His hands burned from the salt and strain, but he didn't stop. Finally, with one last cut, the net gave way. The orca's body shifted, and for a moment Jack feared he was too late. But then the freed orca stirred, releasing a low, guttural call that sent ripples of relief through Jack's chest. The lead orca swam to her side, nuzzling her gently as if encouraging her to move. Slowly, the freed orca began to swim, her movements sluggish but steady. Jack staggered back to the shore, collapsing onto the rocks. His breath came in heavy gasps as he watched the orcas regroup, their calls resonating through the night. He looked back at the archway, its carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. The orcas had led him here not just to save their own, but to uncover a connection between them, the artifacts, and the ancient story etched into the stones. Jack didn't understand it all yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, history, and a message that transcended species. The lead orca surfaced one last time, her gaze locking onto Jack's. She released a deep, resonant call, and Jack swore he could feel the meaning in his chest. Jack sat on the rocky shore, his clothes soaked and his hands raw from cutting the nets. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its vastness more profound than ever. The freed orca swam slowly beside the lead orca, their calls resonating in a haunting harmony that seemed to echo off the cliffs. He turned his gaze back to the ancient archway, its carvings shimmering faintly in the moonlight. The symbols were more than markings. They were a story, one Jack could only begin to comprehend. The pendant, the wooden fragment, the metal plate. They were pieces of a legacy preserved beneath the waves, a connection between the orcas and a past lost to human memory. "You've been protecting this," Jack murmured, glancing at the lead orca. "Sharing it with me." The orca swam closer, lifting her head from the water just enough for her dark eye to meet his. Her gaze was steady, filled with something Jack could only describe as understanding. She let out a deep, resonant rumble, and for the first time, Jack felt not just an observer, but a participant in her world. Standing, Jack gathered the artifacts from the dinghy and set them gently near the archway. He didn't know if they belonged here, but it felt right to leave them where the story began. The orcas circled once more, their movements slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging his gesture. Then, with a final, piercing call that sent a chill down Jack's spine, they swam toward the open sea, their sleek forms disappearing into the darkness. Jack watched them go, the weight of the moment settling over him. The orcas had trusted him, shared their story, and in doing so changed his life forever. As the waves lapped against the rocks, Jack made a silent vow. He would honor their trust, protect their legacy, and share their story with a world that needed to hear it. The bridge between their worlds had been built, and Jack knew his journey had only just begun.